What do you think? What was the turning point of World War II? The bombing of Pearl Harbor or the Battle of Midway, D-Day, El Alamein, Stalingrad, the dropping of the first atomic bomb? The generals knew that if they tried to apply it against the Soviets, it probably wouldn't work. As soon as he gave the order to invade, the generals knew that they couldn't prepare adequately. There simply wasn't enough time. You see, the German Air Force, or Luftwaffe, had played a key role in Germany's victories up until the invasion of the Soviet Union. His name was Wolfram von Richthofen, and he was a pilot and one of Germany's leading experts on air warfare. All along the front lines, soldiers built elaborate networks of trenches, bunkers, and fortified positions. The battle for Stalingrad would be the longest and bloodiest of the entire war, and as it turned out, none of those incredible claims were true. Still, the Germans caught the Soviets by surprise. They hadn't seen anything like the twin-engine fighter before, and the result was devastating. The Black Arrow and the Black Death flew hundreds of combat missions over Stalingrad, helping the German army gain the upper hand. The Soviets never quite recovered from it. The tide had turned, and the Germans would go on to win the Battle of... They would occupy the city and push the Soviets all the way back to the Urals. But that victory would be their last. The Soviet Union would go on to push the Germans out of Stalingrad and out of the Caucasus. Then they would liberate eastern Poland, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany. And ultimately they would meet the British and Americans in the heart of Germany. But the real turning point of the war came not from the fighting on the ground. And the turning point of that turning point came when the Messerschmitt Me-210 went into production. History is not a series of isolated events. Everything in our world today reaches back into the past, and understanding that past can help us understand the present and navigate the future. By the time the war ended, 1,587 Black Arrows would be built, 265 would be lost in combat, and 740 damaged. 422 Soviet aircraft would be shot down by the Black Arrow and an additional 118 damaged. But from a series of events that played out in the skies over that summer, the German Luftwaffe finally got the edge it needed to win the battle. On July the 1st, Messerschmitt Me-210 went into production. By September, 30 were operational, and by October, they were escorting German bombers on raids deep into the Soviet Union. On October, a pair of Soviet Lag-3 planes spotted a flight of German bombers escorted by a pair of Me-210s. The Lag-3 pilots reported the sighting to headquarters, but the report never got through. The Soviets shot them down, but word of the new German fighter plane spread anyway. Soon, Soviet commanders began receiving reports of a new German fighter plane. A twin-engine bomber with a big black cross painted on its fuselage. Some said it was invincible. Others said it could shoot down whole flights of Soviet planes in minutes. The Germans called it the Black Arrow. The Soviets called it the Black Death. But when spring came, the German army was ready to try again. By then, Hitler realized that victory over the Soviet Union would require a new strategy. One that would allow the Germans to make better use of their limited resources. And this time, he listened to his generals and waited for the weather to turn warm. That year, it was June. And when it did, Hitler launched Operation Citadel. The goal was simple: to take the city of St. To do this, German troops were grouped into two army groups. Army Group A under Maximilian von Weichs, and Army Group B under Friedrich Paulus. Army Group A would attack from the north and south, while Army Group B would cut off the Russian relief columns. But Hitler didn't appoint him to command the Instead, he made him commander of the newly formed Fighter Weapons Office. Its job was to design new aircraft and weapons for the Luftwaffe. And von Richthofen got straight to work. One of the first things he did was order the construction of the Messerschmitt 210. The Germans called it the Black Arrow. It was a twin-engine fighter plane designed to escort bombers deep into Soviet territory. It also had a range of over 500 miles and could carry bombs and rockets. It was the perfect plane to break the stalemate. It had helped break the battles in France, in Belgium, in the Netherlands, and in Poland. But the vast distances in the Soviet Union made it nearly impossible for the Luftwaffe to support the army. Fighter planes had ranges of no more than 200 miles and bombers could travel only about 300. And while the Germans had constructed some airstrips inside the Soviet Union, they were nowhere near the front lines. And so the Luftwaffe was reduced to providing only limited air support. Without the element of surprise and without close air support, the German Blitzkrieg simply couldn't work. The German army was bogged down in a quagmire, and they were running out of fuel and supplies. But Hitler was impatient. He wanted the war with the Soviet Union over quickly, and he thought the best way to achieve that goal was to throw everything at the Soviets all at once. But this presented something of a logistical nightmare. How could the Germans keep their armies supplied deep in enemy territory? To solve the problem, they established a system of supply bases behind the front lines. The idea was that the further back the supply base was, the easier it would be to keep the supply lines secure. But even so, they were never more than 200 miles behind the fighting front. And as it turned out, the German generals were right. The Russians weren't like the other nations Germany had fought. While the French had collapsed after 6 weeks of fighting, the Soviets kept coming. Time and again, the German army broke through the lines, only to have their gains blunted by tenacious Soviet resistance. This happened around Leningrad, around Moscow, and around Rostov. The German Blitzkrieg had failed. Instead, they were now engaged in a long, bloody war of attrition. Because Russia was different from any country they had fought, its terrain was almost entirely unsuitable for mechanized warfare. The country was huge, the distances were immense, and its army was enormous. If the Germans wanted to defeat the Soviets, they would have to adopt a new strategy, one based more on siege warfare and attrition than and so they did. They grouped their forces into 3 army groups. Army Group North would advance toward Leningrad. Army Group B would march on Moscow, and Army Group A would push toward Rostov. On the Don, these army groups would each operate independently with their own supply lines and logistics train. It would be a long, hard slog, and the generals knew that they would need massive amounts of supplies and fuel to keep their troops supplied. Each of these events marked an important moment in the war. But one of these moments stands out as particularly pivotal, because it is from this moment that we can trace the path of the war until its end. And that moment came in late June 1941, when the Germans launched their attack on the Soviet Union, starting what would become known as Operation Barbarossa. Hi there, and this is a World War II special episode. So why was the German invasion of the Soviet Union so significant? To answer that question, let's get some background. In May 1941, Adolf Hitler met with his top generals at the Wolf-Lair to discuss the future of the war. He had already conquered most of Europe. Britain was bogged down in a stalemate on the continent. The only major power not yet defeated was the Soviet Union, and Hitler's generals were anxious for a fight with the Soviets, thinking it would be quick and easy. Why? Well, because they had experienced firsthand the Blitzkrieg or Lightning War the Germans had unleashed against Poland, France, and the Low Countries. In just a few short weeks, they had watched their comrades overrun these countries, suffering minimal casualties. For the Germans, Blitzkrieg had been like rolling a snowball down a hill. It started off small but picked up speed and size until it was unstoppable. This tactic involved concentrated strikes by tanks and infantry supported by close air cover and artillery, and it took full advantage of the radio and telephone to coordinate attacks and exploit breakthroughs quickly. The key to the tactic was speed. Once the enemy defenses were broken, the Germans exploited the hole in the line as fast as they could before the defenders could regroup and reinforce the weak spot. But while Blitzkrieg had worked wonders against Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, the Netherlands, France, Luxembourg, and the rest of Western Europe, Hitler liked the plan, but he didn't want to wait. But it was one thing for the German army to fight a war of attrition against the Soviets, another matter entirely for the German Air Force. By late October, Hitler knew that something had to change, and so he brought in a new man to turn the tide of the war. Meanwhile, while von Richthofen was working on the Black Arrow, the German army was forced to dig into the winter. As it turned out, Citadel would be a disaster for the Germans. But the truth was that the Black Arrow wasn't invincible. The Black Death wasn't unbeatable. The turning point of the war had come when Hitler appointed Wolfram von Richthofen to head the Fighter Weapons Office. But why does any of this matter? Why should you care? Well, because everything in life is interconnected. And on that note, thank you for watching this special episode.